My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the steady one, the reliable wife, the calm professional, the woman who never seemed rattled, no matter what room she was in. If you asked people who knew me casually, they'd probably describe me as composed, agreeable, even a little quiet. Some would say I was lucky. Others might say I was protected. Very few would have said I was controlled. I didn't grow up imagining myself as someone who would tell a story like this. I believed in partnership. I believed in compromise. I believed that love was something you proved through patience and understanding. And for a long time, I thought that if something felt heavy, it was simply because marriage required effort. That's what I told myself. That's what everyone told me. From the outside, my life looked orderly. A stable home. A husband who was admired for being attentive and involved. Dinners with friends where nothing seemed wrong. Holidays that went smoothly as long as I followed an unspoken script. What no one saw, and what I barely had words for at the time, was how small my world had quietly become. There's a sentence I once wrote in a private notebook, never intending anyone else to read it. My husband calls it love. I call it control. At the time, even writing that felt disloyal, dramatic, unfair. I crossed it out, then wrote it again weeks later. Because by then, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. This story isn't about sudden cruelty or obvious abuse. There were no raised voices that outsiders could point to. No bruises, no dramatic scenes. That's part of why it took me so long to understand what was happening. Control doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives disguised as concern, preference, or knowing what's best for you. Another truth I had to face, one that took years to say out loud, is this. Our marriage was only happy when I was always obedient. When I anticipated needs, when I didn't challenge decisions, when I made myself smaller in ways that were easy to explain away but hard to survive. What you're about to hear is not a story of revenge. It's not about exposing someone or rewriting the past to make myself look heroic. It's about clarity, about how quiet realizations accumulate, about what happens when silence stops being fear and becomes a choice. I'm telling this story because emotional control thrives in ambiguity. Because many people listening may recognize pieces of themselves here and wonder if they're overreacting, or if they should just be more patient, more grateful, more flexible. I want to be honest about how it felt from the inside, without exaggeration, without spectacle. This is a story about who I was, how I slowly understood the role I'd been assigned, and what changed when I stopped performing it. There are no villains in capes here, just people, patterns, and consequences. If you've ever felt loved and diminished at the same time, if something in you has been quietly asking for permission to trust your own perception, what do you think that voice has been trying to protect you from? I was the person people relied on without ever really seeing. At work, I was described as solid. Not brilliant, not ambitious in a way that threatened anyone. Just dependable. I prepared briefs before meetings so others could skim and speak confidently. I remembered details no one else bothered to track. When decisions went well, the credit floated upward. When something stalled, my name appeared quietly in the background, associated with fixing it. No one meant harm. That's important to say. Invisibility often isn't assigned with cruelty. It's assigned with convenience. Among friends, I was the listener. The one who asked thoughtful questions and never redirected the conversation back to herself. I hosted dinners that felt effortless because I'd planned them for days. If someone needed a favor, they'd say, "Olivia won't mind." And I didn't. Or at least, I didn't say that I did. My marriage fit seamlessly into that version of me. My husband liked to tell people how easy I was, how we never fought, how aligned we were. He said it with pride like he'd won something rare. People smiled approvingly when they heard it. I smiled too because on the surface it sounded like success. What they didn't hear was the subtext. Easy meant adaptable. Easy meant agreeable. Easy meant I learned quickly which opinions would be welcomed and which would be gently corrected. When we were first married, I mistook that correction for intimacy. He knew me so well, I thought. He noticed things others didn't. He'd say, "That's not really you," when I expressed an interest that didn't fit the image he had of me. Or, "You're overthinking," when something made me uneasy. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He sounded certain, calm, loving. Over time, I stopped bringing up the thoughts that led to those responses. It felt efficient, mature, like choosing peace. At family gatherings, I was praised for being supportive, for letting him shine. When I spoke less, people assumed I was modest. When I deferred, they assumed I agreed. No one ever asked if I had chosen that role or simply grown into it. The truth is, I became fluent in anticipation. I learned how to scan a room, read his mood, and adjust my tone. I learned which topics made him tighten and which made him relax. I told myself this was a partnership, two people learning each other deeply. But partnership is mutual adaptation. What I was doing was unilateral. Still, I didn't feel trapped. Not yet. I felt curated, like a version of myself had been selected and polished, and the rest quietly set aside. And because that selected version was praised, by him, by others, I assumed the problem couldn't be real. If everyone were happy, how wrong could it be? There's a strange comfort in being underestimated. Expectations stay low. Conflict stays rare. You're rewarded for consistency. I told myself I preferred it that way, that I wasn't someone who needed to take up space to feel whole. Looking back, I see how carefully I protected that narrative. Any discomfort was reframed as gratitude. Any resistance is immaturity. I was proud of how little I needed. But there's a cost to being endlessly manageable. You become useful instead of known. Valued for stability, not truth. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your inner life starts to feel like something you maintain in private, like a hobby that doesn't belong in shared spaces. At that stage, I didn't think of myself as someone in control. I thought of myself as someone who had chosen calm over chaos, obedience over friction. And because it looked like kindness, no one, including me, questioned it. Not yet. The first moment I remember wasn't dramatic. That's what makes it linger. We were at a small dinner. 6 people, familiar faces. Someone asked me about a project I'd been working on for months. I began to answer, carefully, the way I always did. Halfway through my sentence, my husband smiled and finished it for me. Not inaccurately, not unkindly, just conclusively. He said, "What Olivia means is," and reframed my words into something shorter, cleaner, more impressive. Everyone nodded. The conversation moved on. No one noticed anything wrong. Why would they? It looked like teamwork, like he was helping me articulate something I struggled to explain. I even laughed, lightly, to show there was no tension. My face stayed warm with politeness. But inside, something tightened. It wasn't that he interrupted me. People interrupt each other all the time. It was the ease with which he replaced my voice, and the relief I felt when he did. As if I'd been spared the burden of finishing my own thought. Later that night, I mentioned it. Not accusingly, just as an observation. I said, I was going to explain that a little differently. He looked genuinely surprised, then amused. "Oh," he said, "I didn't think you minded. I was just helping. You tend to get lost in details." That sentence landed softly. No sharp edges. It even sounded affectionate. He kissed my forehead afterward, like punctuation. I told myself I was being sensitive. That became my reflex, to minimize the discomfort before it could harden into something real. I replayed the moment and edited my own reaction. He hadn't meant anything by it. He was proud of me. He just wanted to present things well. The next small cut came weeks later. We were shopping for furniture. I had strong opinions that day. Colors, textures, things that felt grounding to me. I remember reaching for a chair and saying, "I actually really like this one." He glanced at it and shook his head. "No, you don't." He said it jokingly, almost playful, then added, "You think you do, but you'll hate it in a month. Trust me." The sales associate laughed politely. I felt ridiculous for having spoken so confidently. I stepped back and let him choose. On the drive home, I tried to articulate the discomfort again. This time, he sighed. "You're reading into things," he said. "I know you. That's one of the benefits of being married. I can see past your moods." That word, moods, hovered between us. I hadn't been moody. I'd been certain. But certainty didn't fit the narrative as well. So I let it go. What I didn't let go of, what I tucked away quietly, was the pattern. The way my preferences were treated as temporary, emotional, or less informed. The way his certainty was framed as care. Each moment alone was nothing. Together, they began to form a shape. I started to notice how often he spoke on my behalf, how decisions were made after he'd explained what I wanted, how my disagreement was often met with calm reassurance instead of curiosity, as if curiosity wasn't required, because the conclusion had already been reached. When I shared this with a close friend, she smiled sympathetically and said, "At least he's involved. A lot of men don't care at all." I nodded, grateful again, always grateful. That's the trap of subtle disrespect. It arrives wearing gratitude's clothes. You're encouraged to feel lucky, not diminished. And if you ever do feel diminished, you're told it's because you're sensitive, or tired, or misinterpreting intention. I wasn't angry, I wasn't scared, I was confused, because love was still present. Warmth, routine, laughter. But something essential was being shaved down, quietly, without blood. A sense of authorship over my own thoughts. I didn't confront him. Not really. I adjusted. I learned which opinions to voice and which to soften. Which battles weren't worth the subtle exhaustion of being corrected. At the time, I believed I was choosing harmony. I didn't yet understand that each small cut was training me to doubt my own edges, until one day, I wouldn't know where they were anymore. By the time I noticed how often I was being dismissed, it already felt normal. That's how repetition works. It dulls your instincts, turns reaction into routine. I didn't wake up one morning and decide my voice mattered less. I just stopped being surprised when it was treated that way. The corrections became gentler, almost invisible. If I disagreed, he'd tilt his head slightly and say, "You're stressed. Let's talk about this later." Later rarely came. If I insisted, he'd smile and say, "You always do this when you're overwhelmed." There was no anger in it, just calm authority. The kind that makes you question whether resistance is worth the energy. At first, I tried to explain myself more clearly. I added context, evidence, emotional disclaimers. "Maybe I'm wrong, but," became my opening line. It felt responsible, thoughtful, but the more carefully I framed my thoughts, the less weight they seemed to carry. As if caution itself signaled uncertainty, I began editing myself before speaking, not because he asked me to, but because I knew what would follow if I didn't. The patient sighs, the gentle lecture about perspective, the reassurance sounded like a correction. When I stayed quiet, things flowed smoothly. Decisions were made quickly, plans were efficient. The house stayed peaceful. Peace is seductive. I told myself that not every thought needed to be shared, that maturity meant choosing which hills to die on, that marriage required compromise. And since he seemed so sure, maybe it was logical to defer. There were moments when the imbalance was obvious, even to me, like the time he changed our weekend plans without telling me, then seemed genuinely confused when I was upset. "I assumed you'd be fine with it," he said. "You usually are." Or when he shared something personal about me with friends, something I hadn't agreed to disclose, and laughed it off when I asked him not to. "They're not strangers," he said. "You're too private, too sensitive, too emotional, too detail-oriented." I absorbed those labels quietly. If I felt hurt, it must be because I was miscalibrated. He was steady, reasonable, Everyone liked him. He couldn't be the problem. So I became better at agreeing. I learned how to nod without committing, how to smile at conclusions I hadn't reached myself. I learned how to perform relief when decisions were taken out of my hands. And disturbingly, sometimes I was relieved. Thinking less meant feeling less. Arguing less meant being liked more. That's how disrespect survives. It convinces you it's a favor. I stopped using certain words, stopped sharing certain dreams. Not consciously. They just didn't surface anymore. Like muscles you forget to use. There were days I caught myself asking his opinion before I'd even formed my own. That's when something in me flickered, briefly. A question. A discomfort. Then it passed. Life was busy. There were dinners to plan, work deadlines to meet, and responsibilities to manage. I was functional, capable, praised, and deeply split. One version of me moved through the world efficiently, making things easier for everyone else. The other stayed quiet inside, keeping track, observing, not accusing, just noticing. I didn't yet know what to do with those observations, so I filed them away mentally, like notes without a conclusion. I told myself this was just how long relationships evolved. That passion cooled into pragmatism. Strong personalities naturally took the lead. That my discomfort was the cost of stability. And because nothing was obviously wrong, I never named it. But something unnamed doesn't disappear. It accumulates. It waits. At the time, I believed I was being patient, understanding, loving. I didn't realize I was being trained to disappear politely, and that I was cooperating every step of the way. It took me a long time to understand that I wasn't just being dismissed. I was being defined. The role wasn't announced. It was implied, reinforced, and rewarded. I slipped into it so gradually that by the time I noticed, it felt like it had always been mine. I was the reliable one, the emotional stabilizer, the person who smoothed things over before they became uncomfortable. When something went wrong, I absorbed the friction. When something went right, I stayed in the background. He didn't tell me who to be. He just reacted warmly when I fit the role, and coolly when I didn't. If I challenged a decision, the temperature changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Conversations shortened. Affection became delayed. The house felt slightly off balance, like a room after the air pressure shifts. I learned to restore equilibrium quickly. A well-timed agreement. A softened tone. A phrase like, "You're right, I didn't think of it that way." And when I did that, things returned to normal. This wasn't punishment in the obvious sense. It was conditioning. Approval followed compliance. Distance followed resistance. The message was subtle but consistent. Harmony was my responsibility. Others reinforced it without knowing they were doing so. Friends would comment on how patient I was, how supportive, how lucky he was to have someone low maintenance. Family members praised me for being the one who kept things together. No one ever asked how much effort that took or what it cost. At work, the pattern echoed. I was given tasks that required precision, follow-through, and discretion. Rarely credit, rarely authority. When I asked for more visibility, I was told I was indispensable where I was. It sounded like appreciation. It felt like a ceiling. I didn't protest. I internalized the logic. I began to see myself through the lens others offered me. Steady, adaptable, unthreatening. Someone whose value came from consistency, not presence. Usefulness, not voice. The most unsettling part was how convincing it all felt. When I imagined stepping outside that role, being more direct, more demanding, more openly dissatisfied, I felt guilt before I felt courage. Guilt for disrupting the balance, for being difficult, for needing more than what I'd been given. That guilt kept me in place more effectively than any argument ever could. My husband often said, "We make a good team." And we did, if the team required one strategist and one executor. One voice that decided and one that implemented. He admired my efficiency, my calm, my willingness to handle things. I told myself this division of labor made sense, that someone had to be the steady one, that not everyone needed to lead. But leadership wasn't what I wanted. The agency was. Still, I stayed. I adjusted. I refined my role until I performed it flawlessly. I became the person who anticipated needs before they were expressed. She preempted conflict by removing herself from it. She made herself so predictable that her absence of resistance was mistaken for contentment. And because I was good at it, because I was rewarded for it, I stopped questioning whether it was chosen or assigned. That's the danger of roles that look virtuous from the outside. They hide the erosion underneath. I didn't feel oppressed. I felt useful. And usefulness, when praised enough, can masquerade as purpose. But beneath the praise, something in me was watching, measuring, waiting for a moment when the cost of staying quiet would finally outweigh the comfort of being approved. That moment hadn't come yet, but the shape of it was forming. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There wasn't a breaking point or a raised voice. It happened on a day so ordinary that I almost missed it. It was a weekday evening. Rain against the windows. Dinner is already done. He was talking about work, about a decision he'd made that affected both of us. I was listening, nodding in the familiar places, already adjusting my expectations to fit the new plan. At some point he said, "You're fine with this, right?" Not as a question, as punctuation. I opened my mouth to answer automatically, to say yes, to keep things smooth. And then something didn't move. It was like my body paused before my habits could catch up. In that small gap, a thought surfaced. Quiet, clear, unpanicked. When was the last time I was asked what I wanted, and it actually changed something? The question surprised me, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I realized how long I'd gone without asking it. I still said yes. Nothing changed on the surface. The evening continued as planned, but inside a line had been crossed, not by him, but by me. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the question. Not emotionally, clinically, like a data point. I thought about how often, "Are you okay with this?" appeared only after decisions were already made. How often agreement was assumed, not invited. How rarely my preferences shaped outcomes unless they aligned perfectly with his. I didn't feel angry, I felt awake. Awareness doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with stillness. With the unsettling sense that something you've been calling normal doesn't quite hold up under quiet inspection. Over the next few days, I noticed things differently. How he summarized my opinions to others in ways that softened or altered them. How my hesitation was treated as confusion. How certainty, when it came from me, was negotiated, but when it came from him, it was accepted as final. I stopped trying to correct it in the moment. Not out of fear, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see how much of our dynamic relied on my participation. So I listened more than usual. I responded neutrally. I didn't volunteer reassurance or agreement unless it was explicitly requested. What I discovered was subtle but undeniable. The system worked because I worked it. My silence had never been passive. It had been labor. That realization didn't make me want to confront him. It made me want to understand the structure, the incentives, the assumptions. For the first time, I considered the possibility that the relationship wasn't broken. It was optimized. Optimized for his comfort, his certainty, his pace. And my compliance was the lubricant that kept it running smoothly. That thought should have scared me. Instead, it grounded me. Because if something is structured, it can be analyzed. And if it can be analyzed, it can be changed or exited with intention. I began writing again in my notebook. Not feelings, observations, dates, phrases, patterns. Not to build a case, not yet. Just to see clearly. That was the day something shifted. Not externally, not visibly, but internally, something reoriented. From endurance to agency. I still smiled. I still showed up. I still performed my role. But I was no longer asleep inside it. Once I understood that my silence had been doing the work, I stopped treating it like a reflex. I didn't become louder. I didn't correct him more often. I didn't announce any change. From the outside, nothing shifted at all. That was intentional. The difference was internal. I no longer used silence to keep the peace. I used it to gather information. When he spoke over me, I didn't rush to reinsert myself. I noted how quickly the conversation moved on without my contribution. When he made decisions and asked for agreement afterward, I observed how little follow-up he expected. When I hesitated, I watched how discomfort flickered across his face. Not because I was defiant, but because I was unpredictable. Unpredictability, I learned, unsettles control more than confrontation ever could. People assume silence is weakness because they confuse quiet with absence. What they don't realize is that silence can be a vantage point. When you stop defending yourself, others reveal how much they relied on your compliance. I began answering questions literally instead of generously. If he asked, "Are you okay with this?" I replied, "I'll need time to think." No explanation, no apology, just a statement. The first time I did that, he blinked, then laughed, lightly. "Okay," he said, but his tone changed. There was a pause where there hadn't been one before. I didn't fill it. That pause became a tool. I noticed how often I'd previously rushed to reassure him, how quickly I'd softened my edges to keep things flowing. Now, I let pauses stand. Not as punishment, as neutrality. At work, I did the same. I stopped volunteering solutions before being asked. I stopped absorbing tasks that weren't assigned to me. I let minor things fail, not catastrophically, just enough to be visible. People noticed, not immediately, but gradually. Meetings slowed. Questions were redirected. My absence from certain processes created friction that had never been attributed to me before, because it had never been allowed to. No one accused me of anything, but the dynamic shifted. The system adjusted. That's when I understood something critical. I had been the invisible infrastructure. And infrastructure, when it stops functioning, exposes how dependent everything else is on it. At home, the reactions were more personal. He asked if I was tired, if work was stressing me out, if something was wrong. I said no, because nothing was wrong. I wasn't angry, I wasn't distant, I was precise. Precision unsettles people who are used to emotional flexibility from others. It removes the familiar levers: guilt, reassurance, explanation. I still did my share, still contributed, still cared. But I stopped preempting discomfort. I let it exist without managing it. And in that space, I saw clearly how often harmony had been mistaken for health. My silence, now chosen, created a mirror. And what reflected back wasn't cruelty, it was entitlement. The expectation of ease, of agreement, of being centered without question. Seeing that didn't harden me, it clarified me. I wasn't interested in proving anything. I wasn't planning revenge. I was mapping reality. Because once you see the architecture of a dynamic, you can decide whether to live inside it or walk out without collapse. And I was no longer willing to confuse quiet obedience with love. What no one noticed, because no one was looking for it, was how much I was preparing. Preparation didn't look like action. It looked like stillness, like routine, like a woman who had finally settled into herself. That assumption worked in my favor. I kept listening, closely, not just to what was said, but to what was assumed, to the things decided without discussion, to the moments when my presence was treated as confirmation rather than participation. I began documenting, not emotionally but systematically, dates, conversations, decisions framed as mutual that hadn't been, phrases repeated when I hesitated, patterns of reassurance that followed my compliance and withdrawal that followed my resistance. I wrote them down the way an analyst would, not the way a hurt partner would, because hurt clouds judgment. Clarity sharpens it. I also started learning, quietly, in the margins of my life. I reacquainted myself with parts of the world I'd allowed him to manage. Finances, legal structures, long-term implications of decisions I'd once waved through because we'd already talked about it. We hadn't. He had. I reviewed documents I'd signed without discussion. Agreements made for simplicity. accounts I'd trusted him to oversee because he enjoyed that kind of thing. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just an imbalance. Assumptions stacked neatly on top of each other. At work, I paid attention to how authority actually moved. Who spoke, who decided, who executed. I noticed how often I was positioned as support rather than lead, and how easily that position could be reframed if I stopped volunteering myself into it. So I did. I asked questions instead of offering answers. I requested clarity instead of providing cover. I let others feel the weight of decisions I'd previously absorbed. It was uncomfortable, for them. For me, it felt clean. At home, I said less but meant more. I stopped softening my language. Not to be harsh, but to be accurate. If I disagreed, I said so once. Calmly. Without justification. And then I stopped arguing. That was new. He tried to re-engage the old rhythm. Jokes. Light dismissal. Reassurance. You're overthinking again. I didn't correct him. I didn't agree either. That neutrality unsettled him more than any confrontation ever had, because control feeds on reaction. When the reaction disappears, control has nothing to grip. What he never noticed was that my withdrawal wasn't emotional. It was strategic. I wasn't pulling away. I was stepping back to see the full picture. And what I saw was this. My compliance had been the keystone. Remove it carefully, and the structure didn't collapse, but it revealed its stress points. I began positioning myself accordingly. I ensured my independence wasn't theoretical, that my access to information, to resources, to options, was direct, not mediated. I didn't announce these changes. I integrated them quietly, the way one reinforces a foundation before a storm. Still, no one suspected anything. From the outside, I looked unchanged. Calm, reliable, agreeable even. That's the advantage of being underestimated for so long. When you finally move with intention, no one sees it coming. Not because they weren't intelligent, but because they never considered you capable of stepping out of the role they'd assigned. And I let them keep that belief for a while longer. The reveal didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. By the time I uncovered it, I already sensed what I would find. That's the thing about patterns. They don't surprise you once you've been paying attention. They simply crystallize. It happened late one evening, alone at the dining table. Documents spread out in front of me with a precision that would have looked excessive to anyone else. I wasn't searching for betrayal. I wasn't hoping for leverage. I was verifying reality. And reality, when finally seen without distortion, has a particular stillness to it. What I discovered wasn't a secret in the cinematic sense. No hidden accounts, no dramatic lies. Nothing that would make for an explosive confrontation. What it revealed was something more structural and far more important. Nearly every long-term decision we'd made had been optimized for his flexibility, his protection, his exit options. My role in those decisions had been symbolic. Consent without influence, inclusion without agency, clauses written for efficiency, arrangements justified as temporary. Safeguards were placed carefully on one side. I remembered signing documents while he explained them in broad strokes. Remembered trusting the tone more than the content. Remembered how often I'd been told, "This is standard," or "This benefits us both." It didn't. Not equally. Again, nothing illegal. Just asymmetry. Clean, intentional, and quietly reinforced over time. I sat there longer than necessary, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to feel my own reaction without editing it. There was no rage, no urge to expose or accuse, just clarity. This wasn't oversight. It was designed, and suddenly, so many things made sense. Why had my questions always been gently redirected? Why was deeper involvement discouraged under the guise of saving me stress? Why had my trust been treated as a resource rather than a bond? I closed the folder and felt something settle into place. This was the leverage. Not because it gave me power over him, but because it gave me power back. Knowledge realigns the axis. Once you understand the structure you're standing in, you can choose how, and whether, to continue supporting it. I didn't confront him that night, or the next. I slept well, because the moment you stop needing someone to admit the truth, You stop being dependent on their version of it. I adjusted my plans quietly, not in panic, not in haste, with the patience of someone who finally understands the full board. There was no celebration in this phase, no sense of victory, just a sober recognition. The life I thought was shared had been carefully tilted, and I had been steadying it without realizing the cost. Now that I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And I didn't need to, because clarity, once gained, doesn't demand action immediately. It demands alignment. And I was ready to align my next move with reality. Not hope, not fear, not habit, just truth. Once you see the full shape of something, pretending you don't becomes impossible. The decision point wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with a deadline or an ultimatum. It arrived quietly, in the space between what I now knew and what I was still doing out of habit. I gave myself time, not to hesitate, but to consider. I laid out the options the way I would for any complex problem. I could confront him immediately, bring the documents, name the imbalance, demand restructuring, apologies, and change. That path promised intensity, emotion, possibly temporary concessions, and a long future of monitoring whether those concessions were real or simply repackaged. I could stay exactly as I was, now armed with knowledge, and use it as insurance. Live carefully. Protect myself privately. Accept the dynamic as transactional rather than mutual. That option offered stability, with a ceiling I would never stop feeling above me. Or I could choose something quieter, irreversible, clean, not a threat, not a negotiation, a shift so complete that it wouldn't require his agreement to be real. That was the option that stayed with me, not because it was the easiest, but because it respected the truth I'd uncovered. The truth that this relationship functioned smoothly only when I absorbed the imbalance. Any solution that required me to continue absorbing it, even with safeguards, wasn't a solution at all. I wasn't deciding whether I loved him. I wasn't even deciding whether he loved me. I was deciding whether I would continue participating in a structure that required my obedience to function. That clarity changed everything. The final decision wasn't fueled by anger or betrayal. It was fueled by self-respect, the kind that doesn't raise its voice. I chose the path that didn't require permission. I chose to exit the role rather than renegotiate it. Not suddenly, not publicly, but definitely. That choice didn't make me feel powerful in the cinematic sense. It made me feel aligned, as if my inner life and outer actions were finally moving in the same direction. From that moment on, everything I did had one guiding principle. No explanations offered that weren't necessary. No emotional labor spent preparing others for a reality I was already living. I didn't owe anyone a performance of certainty. I only owed myself consistency. So I moved forward, not with urgency, but with intention. And once that decision was made, there was no part of me left behind to argue with it. After the decision, everything became remarkably simple. Not easy, but simple. I stopped imagining conversations that would never happen. I stopped rehearsing explanations I wasn't going to give. Instead, I focused on alignment between what I knew and what I did next. The first rule was quiet, not secrecy born of fear, but discretion born of clarity. I didn't need allies. I didn't need validation. I needed precision. I separated what needed to be separated, administratively, legally, practically. Each step was ordinary on its own, unremarkable. But taken together, they formed a clean line forward. I asked questions, neutral ones. I requested copies. I updated access. I made sure that nothing essential depended on goodwill or assumption anymore. At home, my behavior didn't change enough to raise alarms. I remained calm, engaged, polite. I didn't provoke distance or offer reassurance. I simply stopped managing his expectations for him. That balance, present but no longer accommodating, created just enough ambiguity to keep things stable. He sensed something. Of course he did. People who rely on rhythm always notice when it changes. He asked if I was happy. I said I'm fine. Not defensively, factually. That answer frustrated him more than a complaint ever would have. Complaints invite solutions. Fine offers nothing to fix. I continued my routines. Work, dinners, social obligations. I didn't confide in friends, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want their interpretations clouding my own. This phase wasn't about being seen, it was about being ready. I documented everything I needed to document. I confirmed timelines. I ensured that when the moment came, nothing would be rushed or reactive. From the outside, life looked unchanged. If anything, smoother. And that's the irony of silent preparation. It often improves the present even as it prepares for a different future. I slept better, not because things were resolved, but because they were directed. There's a particular calm that comes from knowing you are no longer negotiating with reality. You're responding to it. By the time the groundwork was complete, there was no adrenaline left, no sense of a countdown, just readiness. That's how I knew I was doing it right. Because when your next step doesn't require courage, only execution, you're no longer acting out of fear. You're acting out of truth. Consequences don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive in confusion. The first thing people noticed wasn't my absence. It was the friction. Small delays, missed handoffs, questions that no one seemed prepared to answer. Systems that had run smoothly now required effort. At home, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Decisions took longer. Plans stalled. He found himself repeating questions he used to answer himself. The ease he'd grown accustomed to, the quiet certainty that things would simply work, began to erode. He didn't connect it to me, not at first. That's the nature of invisible labor. When it stops, the absence feels like an inconvenience, not a loss. He became restless, more directive, less patient. He framed it as stress, work pressure, timing, anything but a structural change. I remained consistent. I responded when asked. I participated when included. But I no longer fill gaps automatically. I no longer anticipated needs that hadn't been expressed. I let consequences land where they belonged. At work, the same pattern emerged. Projects slowed. Meetings stretched. Someone finally asked why certain details hadn't been addressed. I answered honestly. I wasn't assigned that part. There was a pause, a recalibration. People don't like discovering how much they've been relying on someone without acknowledging it. It forces recognition, or resentment. Some chose recognition, others chose irritation. At home, irritation grew. He asked why I seemed distant, why I didn't help the way I used to. Why do things feel harder lately? I listened. I didn't argue. I'm still doing my part, I said once. And it was true. What I didn't say was that my part had always been undefined, limitless, elastic, dependent on my willingness to absorb. Now it had edges. That change unsettled him. He began reminiscing. We used to be so in sync. You've changed. I don't know what's going on with you. Those statements weren't accusations. They were expressions of loss, though he didn't yet know what he'd lost. What he was missing wasn't affection or loyalty. It was compliance. And because compliance had always been framed as love, its absence felt personal, even though nothing personal had been taken away. I didn't correct that framing. I didn't explain. This phase wasn't about being understood. It was about letting reality speak without my interference. The more he pushed for the old rhythm, the more obvious it became how much it had depended on my yielding. That realization was uncomfortable for him. For me, it was clarifying, because I could finally see the difference between being valued and being relied upon. And I knew which one I was no longer willing to be mistaken for. Panic doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like sudden attentiveness, like concern, like questions that arrive long after answers would have mattered. He started noticing details he'd never paid attention to before. Asked where things were, how things worked, why certain arrangements existed the way they did. The tone wasn't angry, it was unsettled, as if the ground beneath something familiar had shifted slightly, and he couldn't tell why. He tried to reinsert warmth, small gestures, compliments that sounded rehearsed, invitations framed as nostalgia. Remember when we used to? Followed by a smile that searched my face for confirmation. I didn't reject any of it. I accepted it politely, the way one accepts something that arrives after a deadline, because timing matters more than intention. He asked if we could talk. I said, about what? That question seemed to disarm him. He hadn't expected it. Us, he said. I feel like something's off. That word again, feel. I listened. He spoke about distance, about confusion, about how he didn't recognize me lately, how I seemed calmer, but also further away. I didn't argue with his perception. I didn't validate it either. I'm not further away, I said. I'm just not filling in the gaps anymore. He didn't understand what that meant. Not fully. And I could see him trying to translate it into something familiar. Stress, mood, dissatisfaction, something fixable. That's when it became clear. He thought this was a phase, a misalignment. Something that could be smoothed over with effort, reassurance, and adjustment. And he hadn't realized that effort had already been expended, just not by him. He offered change in vague terms. We can do better. He offered care without structure. I want you to be happy. He offered presence, but not reflection. What he didn't offer was a re-examination of the foundation, of how decisions were made, of why my compliance had been assumed rather than requested, because to do that would require acknowledging that the comfort he missed had been built on an imbalance. And that realization was arriving too late. I didn't say this to him. There was no need. When people reach for repair only after consequences appear, they're often trying to restore the effect, not address the cause. I had already moved past the stage where reassurance would have mattered, not because I was cold, but because I was done confusing potential with reality. He sensed that finality before it was spoken. You can see it in the way someone's questions change, from curious to urgent, from open to pleading, though still restrained. He asked what I wanted. For the first time in a long time, the question was genuine. And for the first time, the answer no longer required negotiation. When the conversation finally happened, the real one, it was quiet. No raised voices, no accusations stacked like evidence. Just two people sitting across from each other, one searching for restoration, the other offering closure. He asked again what I wanted. Slower this time, as if careful pacing might change the outcome. I told him the truth, plainly, without metaphor. I said I no longer wanted to live inside a dynamic where my agreement was assumed and my silence mistaken for consent. I said I had spent years adapting, absorbing, smoothing, and that I was done doing that work alone. He listened. I'll give him that. Then he explained himself, not defensively, reasonably. He talked about intentions, about stress, about how he never meant to make me feel small, how he thought we were just playing to our strengths. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for reassurance that intention would be enough. It wasn't. I told him I believed he hadn't meant harm. I told him I didn't need him to be a villain for the damage to be real. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. There was nothing to argue against, no tone to counter, no exaggeration to dismantle. I explained that this wasn't about fixing communication or redistributing chores or setting new rules. It was about undoing a structure that had shaped us for too long, and I didn't want to undo it together. That was the moment he understood, not emotionally, but intellectually, that this wasn't a negotiation. He asked if there was anything he could do. I said no, not cruelly, not triumphantly, simply truthfully. Because by the time someone asks how to change, the answer sometimes is that the person they needed to change has already changed herself. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not hostile, just final. I didn't feel relief. I felt steadiness. There was no need to convince him, or justify myself, or make sure he understood every nuance. Understanding wasn't required for the outcome to stand. When I stood up to leave the room, he looked smaller. Not diminished, but disoriented. Like someone realizing a map they'd been using no longer applied. I didn't feel powerful in that moment. I felt free of explanation. After the separation, people expected a transformation they could recognize. They looked for anger, for grief, for reinvention that announced itself loudly. When they didn't see it, they seemed almost disappointed, like I'd skipped a scene they'd been waiting for. But the truth is, nothing about who I am now is sudden. I didn't discover myself. I reclaimed continuity. The quiet parts that had been sidelined, the parts that observed, chose carefully, trusted their own timing. Those were always there. They're just no longer hidden behind accommodation. I still speak calmly. I still listen closely. I still prefer precision over performance. The difference is that I no longer confuse those traits with compliance. I make decisions now without rehearsing how they'll be received. I say no without cushioning it in apology. I let people feel the natural weight of their own assumptions instead of absorbing them for them. Some relationships adjusted. Others fell away. That used to frighten me. Now it feels honest. At work, my role changed. Not because I demanded recognition, but because I stopped providing invisible labor. When my contributions became visible by their absence, conversations shifted. Responsibility redistributed. Authority clarified. I didn't chase influence. I stopped hiding it. In quieter moments, I reflect on the woman I was. How carefully she managed harmony. How much she believed endurance was the same as strength. I don't judge her. She was doing what she thought love required. What I know now is this. Love that depends on your obedience isn't love. It's comfort. And comfort, when unexamined, can become a cage. I don't carry bitterness. Bitterness requires ongoing investment in the past. I'm invested in the present. My life is quieter now, but not smaller. It has edges. Definition. Space for dissent. For myself and for others. I don't need to be underestimated anymore. I don't need to be praised for being easy. I don't need to be managed or managing. I belong to myself, and that sense of belonging, earned, not granted, has changed how I move through every room. Not louder, just unmistakably present. There's a temptation, when telling a story like this, to offer a warning, to outline red flags, to turn lived experience into a checklist that promises safety if followed correctly. But life doesn't work that way. Control rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with threats or ultimatums. More often, it arrives as relief, as certainty, as someone else taking the weight of decisions off your shoulders and calling it care. And for a while, it feels good. That's why it's so difficult to name. Because by the time discomfort surfaces, you've already been rewarded for your adaptability, praised for your patience, framed as the easy one, the one who doesn't make things hard. The cost of that ease isn't visible at first. It accumulates quietly, in the thoughts you don't finish, the preferences you stop voicing, the boundaries you soften until you can't quite feel them anymore. What I learned isn't that love should be loud or conflict heavy. It's that love should be mutual in its effort. If one person is always adjusting, always yielding, always smoothing the path, then what you have isn't harmony. It's imbalance disguised as peace. Leaving didn't make me brave. Seeing clearly did. And clarity doesn't always demand confrontation. Sometimes it demands withdrawal. The refusal to continue participating in a dynamic that requires your silence to function. If there's one moral I hold on to, it's this. You don't owe anyone the version of yourself that was built to survive their comfort. You're allowed to change when the role you've been playing no longer fits the truth of who you are. You're allowed to choose alignment over approval. And you're allowed to do it quietly. If you're listening to this and something in you feels recognized rather than entertained, if you've ever wondered whether being low maintenance has cost you more than you realized, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Where in your life have you mistaken obedience for love? Share in the comments if you feel ready.